True Crime Brewery contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Medical information is opinion based on facts of a crime and should not be interpreted as medical advice or treatment. Listener discretion is advised.
The next thing I knew, I was awakened on the couch, and I was awakened by a combination of hearing my wife screaming for help and asking for me, and my older daughter, 5-year-old, yelling, screaming for help, "Daddy, Daddy, Daddy." And my wife was saying, "Jeff, Jeff, why are they doing this? Help, Jeff." And I started to push up. There was a little light on in the kitchen, which is a small apartment, and there was some light in the living room from this light in the kitchen. And there were, to my immediate view, 3 people. It turned out there were 4, but I saw 3 people, a black male, 2 white males. The black male had on an army jacket with E6 sergeant stripes. In the ensuing struggle, there were 2 episodes of time, very, very brief, in which I saw what I took to be a white female in a broad floppy hat with stringy blonde hair. And I heard her say, "Acid is groovy, kill the pigs." I heard her say that more than once, and also the term acid and rain. It was raining outside at the time. But as I awakened on the couch, I didn't know what was going on. I heard my wife, I heard my daughter, and I saw these people, and I either said, and I to this day don't know if I said it or thought I was going to say it, "What the hell are you doing here? Who are you? What's going on?" And the black male to my left raised something, and he swung a club at me, and I threw my hand up, and he hit me in the head with a club, which I took to be a baseball bat. He drove me back to the couch that I was sleeping on, and now my head was ringing, and I was having a hard time getting up, and the comforter was still over my legs, but I pushed back up, and I'm trying to, and I was getting struck in the chest and about the head, and I threw my hand up again and took another blow to the side of the head. And during this time, I suddenly developed a real severe chest pain. And I remember real distinctly thinking to myself, this guy throws a hell of a punch. And I presume that was the stab wound that collapsed my lung. I didn't know I was being cut. I was, all of a sudden, in this struggle, I'm trying to push these people away and get up at the same time. I finally got my left leg on the floor, and that gave me a little leverage, and I started to move forward, and I finally grabbed the black male's arm as he swung it, and he kept jerking his arm away to pull the weapon away, and my hand kept sliding down on the weapon, which is how I know it was a baseball bat, because it was smooth. The next thing I knew, I was tumbling towards the floor, and I saw the bare knee of what I took to be this white female, and I saw the top of boots. At the time, they were called go-go boots. They were light in color, and they were glistening like they were wet. When I came to, the house was silent, and my first memory, as strange as it sounds, is the smell of Johnson's floor wax. My face was on the floor, and to this day, if I walk in a room that's recently waxed, I get a very weird feeling. When I went down into the master bedroom and found my wife brutally murdered, I tried to give her mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. It didn't work, and eventually I made my way to 2 other bedrooms and found my children in the same state.
Welcome to True Crime Brewery. I'm Jill.
And I'm Dick.
On February 17th, 1970, a shocking crime took place in Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Colette MacDonald and her 2 young daughters were brutally murdered. Colette's husband, Jeffrey MacDonald, was left wounded, but still very much alive. This crime has fascinated, outraged, and polarized people for nearly 50 years now. Speculation in this crime is continued with strings of legal proceedings and outcomes. But at the heart of the case is the relationship of a pregnant young mother with her ambitious husband, along with the character and behavior of a man believed to be either a monster or a gentleman, depending on who you're talking to. Jeffrey MacDonald has a version of what happened that night. Investigators and prosecutors have another version, backed up by what they see as blatant inconsistencies in his story and in the evidence. Today's episode will address the relationship of Jeffrey and his wife Colette, the timeline and evidence of the case, Jeffrey MacDonald's behavior both before and after his family was slaughtered, and the legalities of his conviction and his appeals. Colette and her children died in North Carolina, so Dick has brought along a North Carolina beer.
That I have. And I didn't realize this at the time, but it's another New England IPA, which I just talked about a different one in the previous episode. But be that as it may.
There are no rules. That's fine.
It's not a stout. So this one is called Citraquential by Heist Brewery in Charlotte, North Carolina. So this is, like most any IPAs, a nice hazy orange color with a good-sized white head. There's an aroma and taste of mango, orange, and grapefruit. It's very smooth with a little bitterness at the end with the hops. But boy, this is a nice beer.
Okay, well, thanks for bringing it. Let's open it up.
Okay, let's go.
This is a long story to go over, so we might need more than one beer.
We could.
We definitely will, actually. But let's open this one, and we'll go down to the quiet end.
All right. The quiet end is quiet.
That's how we like it. Why don't you go ahead and start off, because we have a lot of ground to cover.
Okay, so here we go. Jeffrey MacDonald and Colette Stevenson grew up in Patchogue, New York, Long Island. They knew each other since grade school and started dating while they were in high school. Then they broke up before college and dated other people, and then they got back together again. Jeffrey would later tell author Joe McGinnis that he had an active sex life with another girlfriend while he was a high school student. Jeffrey described this girl as very attractive and as someone he enjoyed having sex with, but by the time he was a student at Princeton, he began to think she didn't fit in with his college friends, and so he reached out to Colette. So here we got a guy who's getting laid regularly. But
Mr. Popularity, really.
But she's not good enough for him. She's good enough to fuck. But
wow, you're just coming right out with it today, aren't you?
I am.
Okay.
But she's not good enough because he goes to Princeton.
Well, that's the impression I got, at least from reading Joe McGinnis's book.
And Colette was a more acceptable choice to him.
More of a good girl. It's that kind of a thing.
Yeah. But see, you set this up so I can already be the bad guy.
The bad guy?
The Jeffrey MacDonald hater.
Oh, well, that's okay. I think that there's a lot of the population on your side, so I'm not too worried about that.
Okay. So Colette was her mother Mildred's fourth daughter and the only one who survived past infancy. She has a tough history, Mom.
Very, very heartbreaking.
At 17, Mildred had married a man 10 years older than she. His name was Cowell Stevenson, and he had owned a luncheonette in downtown Patchogue, which was a working-class town on the south shore of Long Island. Mildred had wanted a baby right away, a girl who she could dress up in fancy girly clothes. Mildred decided that if the baby was a girl, she would name it Colette, after the father. The baby was female, yes, but stillborn. That had been the first Colette. So the second pregnancy resulted in another female infant who was going to be the second Colette, but this one was also stillborn.
So this is heartbreaking, and this is something that doesn't happen so much nowadays because we monitor babies with ultrasounds and fetal heart tones.
There's a lot better ways of monitoring pregnancies.
So this happened more often back then, where you think you're doing fine, and then the baby is just not alive.
Right.
Heartbreaking.
Then a year later, a third Colette was born. This baby died within weeks, however, after surgery to try to relieve an intestinal obstruction.
And was that a common thing back then?
Well, I think it's a common thing if you're looking at things that had occurred in the 50s and 60s medically, that you might not always recognize the GI obstruction in a timely fashion. And by the time you pick up that something's wrong, the baby's already gotten incredibly sick and stressed and probably isn't going to survive. So Mildred did have a healthy male child after these three daughters. And then 4 years later, May 10th, 1943, she gave birth to the fourth Colette. This one would live, and this was the one who would marry Jeffrey MacDonald.
Okay, so this is our Colette.
This is our Colette.
But we are realizing now what Colette's mother went through. And when you think that She's going to lose her daughter and her grandkids. That's just more than any one person should have to cope with.
Well, isn't it?
Way beyond,
I mean,
yeah.
Here she's finally gotten her daughter that she's treasured forever. The only one of the other daughters who survived. Only a Colette who survived. And she's killed.
Yes, along
Murdered
with the grandbabies.
with the grandkids.
Mm-hmm. It's terrible. One Friday evening in the spring of 1955, Mildred was returning home from picking up her son at a friend's house. And as she opened the door to her garage, the car headlights lit up her husband, Cowles, hanging in his bathrobe from the rafters. Now, he'd left no note, and she hadn't seen any signs that he was depressed ahead of time. There'd been no sudden trauma in their life, so Mildred just was at a loss. She told friends she had no idea what had driven her husband to suicide. So there's another loss for Mildred.
This is incredible. That poor woman.
I know. Now, Colette, who was 12 when this happened, had been spending the night at a friend's house. Her Aunt Helen had broken the news to her because Mildred just couldn't bring herself to do it. Her father's death was one thing in later years that Colette would never talk about, not to her mother, not to her friends, and not to her husband, Jeff MacDonald. When Colette met Freddie Kassab a year later, she told her mother right away that she hoped the two of them would marry. And after her mom married Freddie Kassab, Colette began immediately to call Freddie her father. She never called him her stepfather.
That's interesting, because she was 12 years old when her biologic father killed himself.
I think that's a testament to the quality of the relationship.
I think so.
Because, preteen girls can be a nightmare.
Tell me about it.
Especially with a new man.
Yeah. So Freddie had been born in Montreal to wealthy Syrian parents and had been educated in European private schools. So he was a child of privilege. At the age of 18, he had enlisted in the Canadian Army and had been assigned to intelligence work. He had served as a liaison with the French resistance in World War II, making parachute drops behind enemy lines. He had been wounded 4 times during the war, and while he was on a mission in Italy, his young Scottish wife and infant daughter had been killed by a German bomb dropped on London. Freddie had returned to North America after the war, moved to an apartment in New York City, and found work at a Sears Roebuck store in Brooklyn, where he sold washing machines. Then in 1957, he met Mildred Stevenson. She was the mother of 2 children, and her husband had killed himself a year before.
So you can see that neither Freddie nor Mildred were strangers to tragedy, even early on. These are 2 people who had been through a lot when they met.
More than the average person would ever think of.
Absolutely, right.
Jeez.
If this was fiction, you wouldn't believe it. They both suffered a great deal of loss in their lives, and the deaths of Colette and her daughters would be devastating. Over the years, they also experienced some financial setbacks. But there were 2 constants in the life of Freddie Kassab. One was his wife Mildred, and the other was his stepdaughter Colette. He thought of her and spoke of her as if she had always been his daughter, and his feeling was reciprocated completely. He was to Colette not a stepdad, but a dad, replacing the dad who had killed himself.
Now, when Jeffrey MacDonald moved into the picture, or when Jeffrey MacDonald came into the picture, Freddie felt like he knew him pretty well. Colette was totally obsessed with him back when they were classmates. She doodled his name, Jeff, in double block letters everywhere. School books, mother's cookbooks, the desk blotter in the Kassab living room.
That is hilarious because that's something my sisters and I would do. We actually used to carve names into the kitchen table.
Oh, I'm sure that went over big with your folks.
Yeah, well, my parents learned not to be picky because it was quite the household.
I guess so.
But yeah, I could just totally see doing that.
So while they were dating, when they were in junior high school, Freddie would often drive them to the movies. And even after they stopped dating and Colette had a new boyfriend, Jeff continued to show up at the Kassab house. He'd mow the lawn in the summer, shovel the driveway in winter. And more than once he would leave a surprise gift for Colette on the back steps of the house. He would ring the doorbell and then run off before anyone could answer the door.
So Jeff would say that Colette was a virgin until college, and he was her first and only. He was a very popular guy, very outgoing, voted most popular and most likely to succeed in his high school class. He was the senior class president, the captain of the football team, and his grades were exceptional enough that he was granted a scholarship to Princeton. This is important to note just because it shows us how being successful and becoming part of the elite was very important to Jeff from a very young age.
It was.
It was a big thing with him.
He strove to be the best at whatever he did.
Absolutely. And we could debate the motivations there, but that's definitely a characteristic that everyone could agree on.
For sure, definitely. So while Jeff was attending Princeton and Colette had entered Skidmore College, they resumed their romantic relationship. This had been on hold for a while in their high school days, but they got back together. So in 1963, 2 years into college, Colette became pregnant, and she and Jeffrey decided to get married. So in April 1964, their first child, Kimberly, was born, and Colette became a full-time mother, while Jeffrey continued his education.
So after 3 years at Princeton, MacDonald was accepted at Northwestern University Medical School, and that's when they moved to Chicago. Their second daughter, Kristen, was born in May of 1967. In 1968, MacDonald graduated from med school. He did an internship at the Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center in New York, and then he joined the Army in July of 1969. That's when the family moved to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, where he was given the rank of captain and they lived on the base. So all this wasn't enough. He also joined the Green Berets and was assigned to the 6th Special Forces Group as group surgeon. So it wasn't enough just to be a captain in the Army. He had to be a Green Beret.
Well, and this was a guy, he graduated college in 3 years. I think that's pretty impressive, particularly for an Ivy League school.
Yeah,
So
it is impressive.
He graduated early. He blew through med school pretty easily. His year of internship, he was a star. I think he was voted the intern of the year, something like that.
Right.
Amazing.
Sure. Plus he's, relatively handsome, charming, charismatic. He really seemed to have everything going for him.
He sure did.
So Colette was busy being a mother, but she had plans to return to college and become a teacher. She announced to friends during Christmas 1969 that Jeff wouldn't be going to Vietnam. He was actually disappointed that he wasn't going to Vietnam. He spent a lot of time away from home, taking on extra responsibilities and other jobs whenever he could. So it would come to light later that he was unfaithful to Colette with several different women throughout their marriage.
Yeah, he was pretty much a serial philanderer. Lots of women.
Lots of women. And that, to me, shows a real personality weakness, like you need constant validation.
Yeah, you're right. That's my take on it.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, the evening of the murders, in MacDonald's version, began with a simple, happy domestic life. After his regular shift at the base hospital, MacDonald took Kimberly and Kristen to feed the pony that he'd brought them that Christmas. Then he went home, showered, and changed into a pair of blue pajamas. He had a quick dinner with Colette and the girls. It was quick because Colette was going to a child psychology class. He put Kristen to bed. Then, exhausted by the 24-hour shift he'd just finished the day before, he fell asleep on the living room floor while watching television. An hour later, Kimberly woke him up and asked if they could watch her favorite show, Laugh-In. She went to bed when the show was over, and about 30 to 40 minutes later, Colette came home. They had a drink in front of the TV. Then as Johnny Carson came on, Colette, who was 4.5 months pregnant with her first son, went to bed. MacDonald said he wasn't ready for sleep, so he finished watching the Carson show and then returned to a Mickey Spillane novel he'd been reading, only to be interrupted by Kristen's crying. He calmed her with a bottle of chocolate milk, finished the book around 2 a.m. Then, after washing the dinner dishes, he went into the master bedroom where he found Kristen sleeping next to her mother, and he also found that she'd wet the bed. Not wanting to wake Colette by changing the sheets, he carried Kristen back to her room, grabbed a blanket, then he lay down on the living room couch and immediately fell asleep. So, okay, we're fine here, right?
Well, I have a lot of questions, but let's finish.
Okay. The next thing MacDonald remembered was waking up to Colette shouting, "Jeff, why are they doing this to me?" and Kimberly screaming, "Daddy, Daddy, Daddy." As soon as he opened his eyes, he saw 4 figures standing over him. A black man in a fatigue jacket with E6 sergeant stripes on the sleeve, 2 white men, and a woman wearing a floppy hat over stringy blonde hair. She held a flickering light in front of her face that appeared to come from a candle, and she was chanting, "Acid is groovy, kill the pigs."
So MacDonald said as he tried to get up, the black man brought a club crashing down on his head. A second later, MacDonald said he felt a sharp pain on the right side of his chest, and looking down he saw an ice pick blade. He said that hands pulled at him as he struggled up, yanking his pajama top over his head and onto his wrists. He used the top to fend off some of the blade thrusts, but the black man kept clubbing at him, and finally MacDonald fell down on the steps of the hallway that led to the bedrooms. When he awoke, MacDonald found Colette sprawled on the master bedroom floor, the handle of a knife sticking out of her chest. On the headboard of the bed, someone had used their finger to write "pig" in blood. So MacDonald pulled the knife out and laid it aside before giving his wife mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. Then, covering her half-naked chest with his pajama top, he went to check on the kids. Both were lying bloody in their bedrooms. So he made the call. He said, "We've been stabbed. People are dying," which a lot of people would say that wording is odd. He didn't say my family is dying.
Right.
My little girls are dying. He said people are dying.
People. So the military police arrived and they found a bloodbath in this apartment. Colette had been stabbed with a knife, which later on was found to be a total of 16 times in the chest and neck and 21 more times in the chest with an ice pick. She had also been hit at least 6 times in the head with a club, and she had broken both her arms, which was felt to be defensive.
Right, trying to block it.
The children were even worse. Kimberly had been struck in the head with a club at least 6 times. One blow shattered her skull, another, to the left side of her face, was delivered with such force that it splintered her nose and cheek, leaving a piece of bone sticking through the skin below her eye. While near death, she had also been stabbed in the neck with a knife several times, so closely and precisely that a pathologist could only estimate the number of wounds at 8 or 10. And then Kimberly's sister, little baby Kristen, who was 3, or almost 3, I guess she's not exactly a baby at that point, had a finger cut to the bone by one wound, suggesting she'd been holding up her hand to protect herself. And she had a total of 33 stab wounds, 12 in the back, 4 in the chest, and 1 in the neck by a knife. 15 more by an ice pick in the chest.
This is such a massive overkill.
Wasn't it?
This is a toddler.
Now, then there's the survivor.
The sole survivor, Jeffrey MacDonald.
He was found lying with his arm around Colette.
Well, by the time the sun was up, the Army's Criminal Investigation Division, or CID, didn't believe his story. So there were a number of things that bothered William Ivory, who was the first CID agent on the scene. Apart from a tipped-over plant and a top-heavy coffee table lying on its side, a position that it would never land in when they did testing, the tiny living room was undisturbed. Odder still, given all the blade thrusts directed at MacDonald, just a single fiber from his pajamas could be found. But in the bedrooms there were dozens of the fibers, including several found beneath Colette, others under Kimberly's sheets, and 2 more in Kristen's room. One was lodged under her fingernail. The trouble was, MacDonald said that he hadn't been wearing the pajama top when he went to his daughter's rooms. He'd already laid it over his wife, Colette. So the blood in the house was very suspicious. There were copious amounts of it in the bedrooms, including little Kristen's, where a bloody footprint matching MacDonald's was found exiting the room. But none on the living room floor, and only a drop too small to be typed on the hallway steps. MacDonald's glasses, which were located near the living room drapes, did have a speck on the front of one of the lenses, but testing would match that blood to Kristen's. That was very odd, since MacDonald said he wasn't wearing the glasses when he went into her room. Ivory later found the tips of surgical gloves beneath the headboard where "pig" had been written in blood. They would eventually be judged identical in composition to a supply in a cabinet beneath the kitchen sink. On the floor alongside the cabinet, Ivory also discovered some drops of blood, the same type as Jeffrey MacDonald's. Outside near the back door, there was another big find, an ice pick and a bloody piece of wood that was about the size of a baseball bat. Now all testing would find had been used in the murders. All, it would be determined, came from the MacDonald apartment as well. So over the next 6 weeks, more evidence pointed in MacDonald's direction, not least of all his own statements.
Yeah, he talked a lot.
He did.
So 3 times shortly after the murders, he'd said, "Be sure to tell the CID I took the knife out of my wife's chest." So why was he so fixated on the bent-bladed knife? Investigators asked themselves.
Well, yeah, and tests would show that the knife had never even been in Colette's chest.
Yeah, so that's a tough one.
Mm-hmm.
MacDonald's injuries also raised eyebrows. According to a staff surgeon, MacDonald's most serious wound was a clean, small, sharp incision in the right chest, which caused an easily remedied partial deflation, called a pneumothorax, of that lung. There were some other comparatively minor findings, but no sign of any ice pick punctures. His spirits didn't appear to have been damaged too much either. Colette's stepfather, Freddie, learned that while hospitalized, MacDonald had enjoyed a bottle of cold duck with some Green Beret buddies.
Well, what MacDonald didn't know was that he and the members of his family all had different blood types. So that's a real statistical anomaly. And that allowed CID agents to track what had happened in the apartment pretty clearly. I mean, if they hadn't had that in this time with no DNA, it wouldn't have been nearly as easy to see the flaws.
That's very true.
The scenario they put together had the fight beginning in the master bedroom, and the likely trigger being some assault on MacDonald's masculinity, which was very important to him. So
something probably got him going, right?
Apparently. Colette, they speculated, got in the first blow, whacking him in the forehead with her hairbrush, and as MacDonald retaliated by clubbing her with a piece of lumber that had recently been used for some household chores, Colette may be swiping back with the bent-bladed knife. Kimberly, whose brain serum was found in the doorway, was struck, and that possibly could have been an accident. He could have been swinging at Colette. Kimberly heard something and came in, and he may have accidentally struck her. We're not sure, but that's what they were thinking. Now, believing Colette dead, MacDonald carried his mortally wounded daughter back to her room with no choice but to finish her off in his eye. Now, after stabbing and bludgeoning her, Kimberly's blood was discovered on the pajama top that he said he hadn't been wearing while he was in her room. He went into Kristen's room, the baby, intent on disposing of the last remaining witness. So before he could do so, Colette, whose blood was found on Kristen's bed covers and on one wall of the room, maybe regained consciousness, stumbled in, and threw herself over her daughter. So after killing both of them, MacDonald wrapped his wife's body in a sheet and carried it back to the master bedroom, leaving a footprint of Colette's blood on the way out. And this scenario is pretty well supported by the evidence.
Well, it's certainly supported by the blood evidence.
Right.
And as you mentioned, they all had different blood types. So they could look at what blood type was found in what place and figure out a scenario, which is a very plausible scenario.
Which was pretty lucky for the investigators.
Wasn't it?
Unlucky for MacDonald.
Yeah, then the theory, according to the CID, was that the cover-up would begin. And MacDonald took his cues from reading about California and the Manson murders in a blood-smudged March 1970 edition of Esquire that was found in the living room. So he took a disposable scalpel blade from a supply in the hallway closet. He had a whole infirmary stashed away in his house.
He did, which is odd.
It is, although he's a gung-ho medical guy. So he's going to be prepared for anything, right?
I understand that, but I mean, it just seems a bit much.
It does.
And some of the medications he had, I don't think it was really legitimate for him to have them.
No, he didn't need them.
No.
But he went to his medical stash and then went to the adjacent bathroom, carefully stuck himself between the 7th and 8th ribs, Putting on the surgical gloves, he proceeded to the master bedroom, where after dipping his finger in Colette's blood and writing "pig" on the headboard, he laid his pajama top over his wife's chest and repeatedly stabbed through it with an ice pick. Then, with the gloves still on, he used the master bedroom and kitchen phones to call for help, threw the club, the ice pick, and the knife out the back door, messed up the living room, and flushed the gloves and scalpel blade down the toilet, or maybe thrown them in the garbage, which the CID allowed to be removed before inspecting the crime scene.
So even though we do believe he's guilty, we do have to concede that there were some errors made in this investigation.
Well, the CID really screwed it up.
Yeah.
Totally.
But this isn't like something that you do every day. But they did, you're right, they did screw it up a lot. There were a lot of mistakes.
Well, there were. They made a ton of errors. Biggest was not sealing off the crime scene.
That's a big one.
More than 24 people tramped through the crime scene before it was finally secured, including an ambulance driver who stole MacDonald's wallet. They lost the blue fiber that was found beneath Kristen's fingernail and a piece of skin taken from one of Colette's nails. They let a doctor turn over Colette's body and move the pajama top. Incredibly, investigators also allowed 40 sets of fingerprints to be destroyed, including the bloody footprint, and potentially critical pieces of physical evidence were discarded. Even the significance of the Esquire articles, which according to investigators contained 18 similarities to the murders, including a blonde candle-carrying hippie woman, wasn't realized until various CID men had spent days turning through the blood-marked magazine.
Well, I find that very strange. But I guess it's 1970. Maybe things weren't as precise back then. I don't know. But definitely it seems like mistakes were made.
Serious mistakes.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Right?
Yes. And I think that's why it took so long to prosecute. But hoping a confession would make up for their mistakes, the CID formally advised MacDonald of his rights 7 weeks after the murders. He showed very little emotion about his family during questioning, but he did agree to take a polygraph. 10 minutes after leaving the headquarters, however, he called to say he'd changed his mind. Then within hours, the Army put him under armed guard.
Yeah, so let's go over the extensive evidence so far.
This could take a while, but let's start with the blood evidence.
Okay. So this is the most important forensic evidence early in the investigation. Now, as you said, a lucky thing was that each of the MacDonald family members had a different blood type. So this gave the CID sort of a map of family members' movements and locations during the commission of the crime. So MacDonald's blood type, type B, was found on the front and right side of the sink in the hallway bathroom. 5 drops of his blood were also found on the kitchen floor near the front of the sink. His blood was also found near the left elbow of his pajama top, on the hallway closet door, and on the bottom edge of the door jamb in the east bedroom. Probably more important is where his blood was not found than where it was found.
Right.
Then Colette's blood, type A, where was that?
That was found in a very large blood stain on the master bedroom carpet. It was also found splattered on the top sheet of the master bed, in massive amounts on the blue bed sheet and bedspread found clumped together in the master bedroom as well. Her blood was found in streaks on the master bedroom ceiling and inside the master bedroom closet. Colette's blood was also found in 2 direct bleeding stains that were on top of Kristen's bed and in blood spatter on Kristen's wall next to the bed. So that supports the idea that she regained consciousness and tried to go in and protect her daughter, and they were both murdered. Her blood was also used to spell out the word pig sideways on the master bed headboard. Her blood formed a footprint thought to be made by Jeff's left foot exiting baby Kristen's room. Blood streaks from wiping blood off of a weapon on a Hilton Hotel bath mat were also Colette's. Her blood was found all over Jeff's pajama top, on the dining room floor and on the bathroom wall to the left of the sink. So Colette's blood was everywhere, really.
It was.
But really not much blood in the living room where this primary attack of Jeff MacDonald's was supposed to take place.
Right. And Kimberly, the 5-year-old daughter, had type AB blood, and her blood was found in a 6-inch circle just outside the entrance to the master bedroom. Then there was a trail of her blood beginning at the entrance to the master bedroom and ending near the entrance to Kimberly's room. Her blood was spattered on her bedroom ceiling and wall, and there was a transfer stain on her sister's bedspread. So Kimberly had bled directly onto her blue bedsheet, and her blood was also found on Jeffrey's pajama top. Her blood was also streaked on the Hilton bath mat and smudged on the dining room floor. And then there's baby Kristen. She apparently never left her bed. She was type O blood, and there was direct bleeding on her pillow in bed, mattress and box spring, and a pool of blood on the floor next to her bed. There was also a spot of her blood on the outer lens of Jeffrey MacDonald's glasses.
Okay, now what about fingerprints? There were actually 104 prints of value that were found in the home. 30 were unidentified, 10 to 13 were destroyed, and 7 were accidentally destroyed in the process of being photographed. None of the unidentified prints matched a known suspect. No fingerprints were taken from the children to compare them. The partial prints taken from Colette at autopsy were of very poor quality. Technicians believe that partial prints on the household blinds belonged to Colette, and that the prints on lower portions of the walls and door frames were likely from the children. So just because they're not identified doesn't mean that they're not someone who lived there's partial print or smudged print. So a lot of people have used that to point out, well, who left those prints? But it wasn't necessarily a stranger or an intruder that did that.
No, it wasn't. I mean, they could say that the prints were poor quality and they couldn't identify them with certainty.
Not to mention the ones they destroyed.
Right.
Well, there were 3 bare bloody footprints found also. All 3 were found exiting Kristen's room. A partial left footprint and a right footprint were found just inside Kristen's room, and another partial left footprint was found in the middle of the hallway outside of Kristen's room. The right footprint was made of Colette's blood or Kimberly's blood, and the partial left footprint was formed in Colette's blood. The prints were determined to belong to Jeffrey MacDonald. Investigators surmised that he placed the colored bedspread on Kristen's floor and set Colette's body on the bedspread. The heavy bedspread protected the floor from Colette's blood. MacDonald then used the blue bedsheet to lift Colette's body off of the bedspread. Andy may have stepped on the bloody bedspread and carried Colette back to the master bedroom in that blue bedsheet. Fabric impression analysis showed bloody pajama cuff impressions on the bedsheet, which indicated that Jeffrey and Colette came in direct contact with the sheet. The left footprint formation showed that he had been carrying something heavy as he left Kristen's room. So all this supports him killing Colette in Kristen's room and then bringing her back to the master bedroom.
Then there's a big piece of evidence, and that was Jeffrey MacDonald's pajama top. The yarns from the pajama top are a blend, while the sewing threads are composed of cotton. Color of the threads is purple, and that's seen in most of the seams, and blue-black in certain areas beneath the seam and in the piping on the sleeves. The sleeves of the pajama top are loose-fitting, and there are no buttons on the cuffs.
Which is significant when he's talking about how it got wrapped around his wrists. So he was kind of bound with it as he was fighting them off.
Right.
If it didn't have buttons on the cuffs, it seems like it would be kind of loose for that.
Be easy to pull it off.
It seems like it.
Right. The pajama top had been extensively laundered, which weakened the sewing threads and removed a good portion of the dye from the threads. In 1971, approximately a year, 6 or 12 months after the murders, the tears in the pajama top were studied, and investigators attempted to see if they could explain how the pajama top had been torn. The top was ripped down the front, left shoulder, and left sleeve, down to the cuff. So they concluded that someone grabbed the pajama top in the V-neck section and pulled down as Jeffrey MacDonald spun to his right. Jeffrey MacDonald has consistently claimed that the pajama top was pulled over his head by intruders and that it ended up around his wrists. So those two stories don't jibe.
No, they don't. Well, the tear down the left front seam and left sleeve of the pajama top resulted in a release of pajama threads and yarns in the master bedroom. And it led them to conclude that when a garment is torn as the pajama top is torn, the bulk of the broken yarns and threads will become dislodged and fall off in the immediate area where the damage happened. MacDonald insisted that the immediate area where the damage to the pajama top occurred was in the living room, but no threads or yarns from the pajama top were found in the living room. So his story just doesn't jibe. I find the pajama top to be very significant.
Yeah, for sure. So Jeffrey MacDonald claimed that he never got on the bed in the master bedroom, nor did he get on the bed with either Kristen or Kimberly after he found them the morning of February 17th, 1970. He also said that he was not wearing his pajama top when he first discovered Kimberly and Kristen in their beds. Investigators, however, found 28 pajama fibers on the master bed, 19 fibers on Kimberly's bed, and 2 more on Kristen's bed. A pajama fiber was also found near the headboard of the master bed where the word pig had been written in Colette's blood. Jeffrey MacDonald told investigators that he had never approached the headboard, nor did he even notice the word pig.
Well, when the medics lifted Colette's body off the floor that night in the master bedroom, investigators William Ivory and Robert Shaw noticed a lot of pajama fibers were located on the floor beneath her. So how'd they get there? Investigators eventually collected 24 pajama fibers in this area, and one of these fibers was located directly under her head. Ivory noticed that this fiber was sticking up from a large pool of Colette's blood. Investigators wondered how so many pajama fibers could end up underneath her body when Jeff insisted that he remove the pajama top from his hands and that he placed it across his wife's chest. So interesting, huh?
There's a lot of evidence that suggests that MacDonald killed his family.
There is.
Okay.
But then you have to weigh that against the errors that were made.
Right. Well, we'll get into that with a little more detail.
Okay, let's just take a quick break here to talk about a new podcast that I think our listeners might enjoy. It's called The Dream. The Dream is a new podcast about the world of multi-level marketing and pyramid selling. So I always find this an entertaining topic. Multi-level marketing businesses have a pretty good pitch that a lot of people fall for. It's, if you try hard enough, you can be rich. People sell essential oils, beauty products, diet supplements, all kinds of stuff to their friends and family through social media posts and by having home parties. You can do it all from home. Do this right, they say, and you'll get rich quick. So the host of The Dream, Jane Marie, goes to her hometown in Michigan where these schemes are very popular, especially among women. She talks to friends and family who join these MLMs, as they call them, to find out what happened. And one producer even goes undercover to learn what it's like from the inside. I really love this kind of shit because this is like 60 Minutes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I remember a time when I was just newly starting out as a real doctor. I'd been through all my training, had my first real job.
Mm-hmm.
And some parents of a patient came calling that they wanted to talk about their multi-level marketing business, which I will leave nameless.
Good idea.
But they were a hard sell. They kept me going for almost 3 hours.
You are such a nice guy, though.
Well, possibly. But it was tough to get them out of the house. And I finally realized that what they were talking about was a pyramid scheme.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, well, okay, I'm not interested. And they finally gave up.
I think that's funny because they obviously knew that you had a career. It's just kind of funny to me that they tried to sell it to their pediatrician.
Yeah, I think they thought I was an easy mark. I had all this money.
Oh, they wanted you to invest money.
Yeah, they wanted me to buy stuff.
Well, these MLMs do promise empowerment and entrepreneurial success, but when it comes to achieving the American dream, they're really often too good to be true, which isn't surprising. Now, you can find The Dream in your podcast app, like Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, whichever one you use, and subscribe so you won't miss an episode. I'm going to listen because I just love this kind of stuff. I think it'll be really interesting, especially the undercover part.
Oh, no kidding.
All right, so let's get back to the evidence in the MacDonald case.
Yeah, Tell me about the weapons.
The weapons. Well, there were 4 weapons found at the crime scene. A Geneva forged knife was found in the master bedroom, and a wooden club was found on the ground just outside the back door. An ice pick and an old hickory knife were found about 20 feet from the back door, lying side by side beneath a bush. The Geneva forged knife was a paring knife with a dull, bent blade. An analysis of the blade by FBI expert Paul Strombaugh demonstrated that this knife made the 2 cuts in Jeffrey MacDonald's pajama top. In 1970, Pamela Kalin told CID investigators that when she was babysitting the MacDonald children, she remembered seeing this knife in the kitchen. In subsequent years, she kind of waffled on IDing this knife. There was a minute trace of Colette MacDonald's type A blood on the handle of this knife. The old hickory knife was also a paring knife with an extremely sharp, straight blade. Analysis of the blade demonstrated that this knife made the cuts in the pajamas worn by Colette and by Kristen MacDonald. CID investigators traced the knife to either the post exchange on Fort Bragg or Pope Air Force Base, and this knife appeared to have been wiped clean of blood.
Then there's the ice pick. This instrument also appeared to have been wiped clean of blood. Analysis of the pick by Strombaugh demonstrated that this weapon made the puncture holes in the pajamas worn by Jeffrey, Colette, and Kristen. 3 individuals came forward to state that they had either seen the ice pick in the MacDonald residence or heard Jeffrey MacDonald mention that he owned an ice pick.
Well, during the 1979 trial, Mildred and Pamela Kalin testified to having seen an ice pick at the MacDonald house. Ron Harrison was Jeffrey MacDonald's best friend at Fort Bragg, and he told both CID investigators and the grand jury that Jeffrey MacDonald was looking for an ice pick during a Thanksgiving visit. Now, Harrison added that he used his own pocket knife to pry some ice apart after Jeff MacDonald couldn't locate the ice pick.
But there was an ice pick. He just couldn't find it.
Well, if you're going to believe Mildred and the babysitter, seems that there was.
Well, the last thing, his friend, that over a Thanksgiving visit, Donald was looking for the ice pick but couldn't find it.
So he knew he owned one.
Right.
Yeah.
Then we have the club. This was a weathered piece of wood that measured about 31 inches in length. In 1970, labs matched paint found on the club to paint found on the sidewalk in the back of the MacDonald residence. In 1971, CID investigator William Ivory removed a wooden slat underneath Kimberly MacDonald's bed. Grain pattern analysis proved conclusively that the club had been sawed from one end of a piece of wood that had been used to make the bed slat. The club itself bore traces of Colette's type A blood and Kimberly's type AB blood. 2 pajama seam threads were found stuck to the club in Colette's blood. An additional trace evidence found on the club included 2 unsourced dark woolen fibers, multiple fibers sourced to a throw rug in the master bedroom, and several unsourced animal hairs. Autopsy records concluded that the blunt trauma injuries to Colette and Kimberly were the result of blows from that club. Wooden splinters from the club were found in Colette's left hand, under her body, on top of the master bed, under the bed covers in Kimberly's room, and on top of the bedspread in Kristen's room. No wood splinters were found in the living room, where Jeffrey MacDonald claimed he was struck with the club.
Okay, so if that's the case, that means that these people came to the house with no weapons of their own and just used stuff from around the house, which is kind of odd.
It is, because if you're going to believe this Manson-type killing, they should bring things with them.
You would think so. Well, some other miscellaneous evidence to note would be a white terry cloth bathrobe that was found hanging on the door leading to the master bedroom. There were traces of blood found on the outside of the robe, but they were so minute that they couldn't be typed. And also blades of grass were adhering to the bottom of this robe. Fibers from MacDonald's pajama top were also found on the inside of the robe. CID investigators felt that MacDonald may have put the robe on prior to going outside and putting the weapons in the backyard. They also surmised that while squatting to place the weapons on the wet ground, blades of grass may have stuck to the bottom of the robe.
So during an April 6, 1970 interview with these same 3 CID investigators, MacDonald was asked whether he wore that robe at any time on February 16, 1970. He denied wearing the robe on that date. Now, it is quite feasible that MacDonald went to the back door and underhandedly tossed the old hickory knife and ice pick. So considering that the distance from the back door to the large bush is only 20 feet, it is possible that MacDonald was able to toss the weapons and have them land near each other under the bush. Although I would say not that likely. I think it's possible.
Sure.
But no.
But they're so close together.
How can you get them that close together?
Yeah, it's more likely, I think, that he walked out there.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, what about the suitcase? This is something you don't hear much about.
No, they found a suitcase near the right-hand corner of the footboard of the master bedroom. The unusual aspect of this suitcase was the fact that spatter in Colette's blood type was found around and under the suitcase, but no blood spatter was found on the suitcase.
This blood analysis indicated that the suitcase had been moved from an unknown location and sat down near the footboard. The analysis also lent credence to the assumption that the suitcase had been placed in that area of the master bedroom after all of the blood had been shed at the crime scene. Now, William Ivory inspected this suitcase and he found that it was empty. But he did note that one of Colette's dresser drawers was opened slightly. And then speculation followed that MacDonald may have emptied the contents of the suitcase into Colette's dresser. So this would have been after the crime. Maybe he thought for a minute that he would just get the hell out of Dodge and flee, because he probably realized he'd done something really awful. It wouldn't be unheard of to think, oh, I better flee.
Well, it wouldn't, but if you flee, you're sort of signaling your guilt, right?
If you flee, you have to really not be found.
No. He probably figured it was better to stay and formulate this story, which at least gives him a fighting chance. Author Joe McGinnis attempted to formulate a theory as to what might have precipitated Jeffrey MacDonald's murderous rampage on February 17, 1970. After reading MacDonald's private notes, McGinnis felt that MacDonald could have killed his family as a result of an amphetamine psychosis. MacDonald had mentioned in his notes that he was taking esketrol for weight loss, and McGinnis thought that that may have been the missing piece to the puzzle.
So esketrol is like Adderall or is it a stronger amphetamine? It's like Dexedrine?
Yeah, it's an amphetamine.
Yeah. So I really like that idea. I like that theory. I
mean, there were signs that he was taking the esketrol, or that he was taking some amphetamine, right? I mean, this guy is working 24-hour shifts in his base hospital. On days that he's not working, he's moonlighting at a couple other hospitals in the area. He still has found time to be the team physician for the boxing team. I think it was boxing.
I think so, yes.
And he found the energy to have a few affairs, extramarital affairs.
Well, it gets me that he had worked this shift, come home, taken care of the kids, said that he cleaned the dishes, watched Johnny Carson, and then wanted to stay up and read a book. I mean, someone with his life should have been exhausted.
Yeah, he's just come off of a 24-hour shift.
Who does that?
He should be a zombie.
He should be.
I know how I felt coming off of those.
Right.
Don't bother waking me till the next day.
No, I mean, you're exhausted.
Yeah.
So I find that really, interesting, although I believe that any blood tests they did were negative, but I don't know the time frame of the drug testing.
Right. No, I don't even worry about that.
Why is that?
Just the history that he was taking it, and who knows, like you said, when the blood test was done.
So that wouldn't factor into it too much for you?
Not for me.
Okay. Well, let's go over in some detail these wounds that each of the family members had.
Okay.
We'll start with Colette. Colette sustained severe blunt trauma injuries to her head and her arms. She was struck at least 6 times in the head with the blunt object, resulting in lacerations to her right temple, left temple, forehead, and the top of her head. All of these lacerations were deep enough to expose bone. She also received 2 blows under her chin, resulting in extensive bruising to the front left chin area and the right front chin area. There was a small fracture in the midline portion of her skull. The blunt trauma injuries to her arms were defensive type wounds. Colette's right wrist was fractured, and the inner aspect of her upper arm had extensive bruising and a superficial abrasion. Her fingers and the hand of her right arm had extensive black and blue marks with abrasions. Her left arm was also fractured in 2 places. Colette had 9 deep knife wounds at the front of her neck, 7 deep knife wounds to her chest, and 21 puncture wounds to her chest. Her chest also bore a pattern bruise, which indicated she'd been struck at arm's length by a bayonet-type thrust with the blunt object.
So in simple terms, she was really beat up.
Really beat up.
Now,
Beyond what it would take to kill her.
Beyond what it would take. A rage type of killing.
It really indicates that, yeah.
So Kimberly, who's the older daughter,
Yeah, 5 years old.
was struck at least 3 times in the head with a blunt object. The first blow resulted in her blood being spattered on the door frame leading to the master bedroom. Kimberly's right cheek, right ear, and right mastoid area, that's the area behind the ear, had overlapping black and blue marks and irregular abrasions. Her right eye was recessed, and she had a fractured nose which was deviated to the right. Her left cheekbone was fractured, and a piece of the cheekbone was protruding through the skin. Kimberly's skull showed multiple fractures, and the dome portion of her skull was fractured through its entire thickness and slightly dislocated. 8 to 10 deep knife wounds were found on the right side of her neck.
So that's just as brutal as Colette's.
Again, we have just a horrific, brutal crime.
Now, Kristen had 12 gaping knife wounds to her upper back, 4 wounds to her chest, and 1 to her neck. 2 of the wounds to her back penetrated her heart, which of course caused massive internal bleeding. 15 shallow puncture wounds were found in her chest, as well as multiple cuts on both of her hands, which were defensive wounds. There was a through-and-through laceration of the skin involving the middle of the right ring finger, and this laceration was deep enough to expose bone, and the index finger of the right hand revealed a triangular flap of skin that had been cut.
Now Dad and husband Jeffrey, the number and listing of wounds on his body was not consistently reported. So we're going to list the wounds that were cataloged by a majority of the physicians who examined him at the hospital immediately and in the days following the deaths of his family members.
Well, yeah, because Jeff was out there giving different stories on all these injuries that he had.
Yeah, it
saying
almost
he had
seems
30
like
injuries.
each time he told the story, the injuries got worse.
And he wasn't smart about it. I mean, didn't he say it on a television interview? He said that he had way more injuries than he did.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the things that set off Freddie Kassab to change his mind about Jeff's innocence. But anyway, I digress. Go ahead with the injuries that Jeff actually did have.
So he had some bruising over the left eye beneath the hairline. He had a superficial stab wound of the upper left arm and a superficial stab wound of the left bicep. He also had a superficial laceration of the left index finger and a superficial stab wound to the left abdomen. Several small puncture-type wounds were present in the upper left chest area. None of these wounds required suturing, so they weren't deep.
No, I mean, they were really nicks.
Then there was a neat and clean stab wound, 1 centimeter in length, located between 2 ribs on the right side of his chest. This resulted in a collapse of the right lung.
So how painful would that be, do you think?
That would hurt.
It would hurt.
Yeah, but he's a physician. He knows, if we're thinking he's staging this, he would know where to do it with the least amount of pain.
Yeah, and he was a surgeon, not just a physician. He was used to doing surgeries. Okay, well, because of his lack of any serious injuries and because of many other reasons that we've mentioned or that we still need to get to, the CID suspected him of committing this crime.
Well, sure. I mean, if you compare the wounds of his family members to his wounds, he sure got off easy.
Yes, absolutely.
I mean, his wife and daughters were just horribly wounded and mutilated.
Mm-hmm.
And he's got nothing, basically. He's got that one wound that required a chest tube for a short time.
But nothing significant as far as defense wounds, as if he was fighting someone off.
No.
Well, still, it was 3 months before an Article 32 hearing was held, and that's the Army's equivalent to a grand jury. Now, MacDonald's mother hired him a civilian attorney, a former ACLU lawyer from Philadelphia, and his name was Bernard Siegel. Like the CID investigators, Siegel was struck by his client's almost total lack of emotion while he described the night of the murders. Only when MacDonald talked about discovering Kristen was there any sign of sadness. Guessing that the flat affect was MacDonald's doctor-trained way of dealing with death, Siegel had him evaluated by a psychiatrist, who found possibly some latent homosexual conflicts, as well as some narcissistic need to be famous or infamous. Still, overall, the psychiatrist said that he was fairly certain that MacDonald had not killed his wife and children. Do you want to say anything now about this latent homosexuality or narcissism?
I don't know that I can really comment sufficiently on the latent homosexuality.
No, but it does make you wonder about his being susceptible to anything that would insult his masculinity or him as a man.
Okay.
That might set him off.
Maybe that's why he was having numerous affairs.
Perhaps.
To prove?
To prove it, yeah. It's all speculation, though.
It is.
Yeah.
So the psychiatrist's conclusion was one of the centerpieces of Siegel's defense. This also focused on the mistakes of the CID investigation, and there were lots, and the all-American boy image of MacDonald. And there's a parade of witnesses, including Freddie Kassab, who attested to MacDonald's good character. "If I ever had another daughter," Freddie said, "I'd still want the same son-in-law." Then Freddie announced a $5,000 reward for information leading to the arrest of the real killers.
A short time later, a 22-year-old delivery man named William Posey went to Siegel with a story. While living in the hippie district of nearby Fayetteville, Posey said he had a neighbor he knew by the name of Helen, and during a trip to the bathroom around 4 a.m. on the night of the murders, Posey said, he looked out the window and he saw a Mustang pull up next door, carrying Helen and 2 or 3 men. About 2 weeks later, Posey said, Helen mentioned that she was going to have to leave town because the police had been hassling her about her possible involvement in the MacDonald killings. The trouble, Helen said, was that she'd been so high on mescaline and LSD that night that she couldn't remember what she'd done. Posey told something else to Siegel as well. Helen had been in the habit of wearing a floppy hat and a blonde wig, but after February 17th, he never saw her wearing them again.
So maybe MacDonald's story is true.
That's the thing to consider at that point. But the CID already did know about Helen.
Right, her real name was Helena Stockley, and she would be the center of MacDonald's later claims of innocence. She's the daughter of a lieutenant colonel in the service who'd thrown her out of the house for using drugs. At that time, Stockley was 18, and she was a very poor historian, obviously based on her drug use. Nonetheless, Ivory interviewed her a few days after the killings and re-interviewed her again after hearing Posey's story. Neither time did she say anything useful, just that she no longer had the floppy hat or wig. She was sure, though, that she hadn't ever been inside the MacDonald house. She didn't know the address. So inconsequential was this information, Ivory didn't bother taking notes. Yeah.
I'm not sure if that was smart.
That's probably not a good idea.
No, it probably should have been recorded.
A lot of women in Fayetteville had blonde wigs and floppy hats, including Colette MacDonald.
Yeah, this is 1970. This was a look that people wore.
Right. Now, the colonel presiding over the Article 32 hearing took Stockley much more seriously, and a recommendation that appropriate civilian authorities investigate further was one of 2 findings in his final report. The other finding was that, in the absence of a demonstrative motive and a competent investigation, charges against Captain Jeffrey MacDonald are not true. So that ends it.
So that could have been the end of the whole thing.
Could have been. Except for one thing. Freddie.
Freddie. Yeah, everything would have ended there except Freddie was very determined. He was heartsick over the killings and enraged by the Army's hounding of MacDonald, who he claimed was innocent and defended, and he decided to get to the bottom of the case and clear Jeffrey's name, basically. After immediately applying for honorable discharge, Jeff MacDonald had disposed of most of his family's possessions in a yard sale, and he moved to New York, where in between socializing and searching for a journalist who would pay for his story, he made some derogatory remarks about Army investigators on the Dick Cavett show. Now, his whole affect on that show is creepy.
Yeah, we watched that.
I mean, he's joking, he's enjoying the attention. It's very bizarre.
But still, Freddie persisted.
He did.
In his attempt to clear him. So MacDonald reluctantly humored him, first by telling him that he and several other Green Berets had tracked down one of the killers and put him 6 feet under. Then he provided the transcript of the Article 32 hearings that Freddie had been requesting for months. These turned out to be 2 mistakes on Jeffrey's part.
Sure, because Freddie changed his mind, dissuaded Freddie to think that Jeff actually did it. While reading over the testimony, Freddie found items which just couldn't be true, such as MacDonald's claim that he had seen blood bubble up from Kimberly's chest. The room was dark and Kimberly's chest had no wounds, so that didn't happen. There were also no records of suspects killed by MacDonald or his Green Beret friends. That was clearly a lie. Beginning to believe the worst, Freddie called the CID. They were also reviewing the case, at least partly in response to MacDonald's remarks on the Dick Cavett show, so that really came back to bite him on the ass. Soon Freddie went to 544 Castle Drive, the crime scene, and he began going over the crime scene inch by inch with a fine-tooth comb, if you will. And when he finished, Jeffrey MacDonald's most outspoken defender had become his most determined enemy.
Yeah, because he's figured out that things could not have occurred as MacDonald said they happened.
No, things were very, very different than MacDonald had led him to believe. But still, he was unaware of Freddie's change of mind, and he went ahead and moved on with his life. He'd begun working as an emergency room physician at St. Mary Medical Center in Long Beach, California. And he seemed to be enjoying his newfound bachelorhood. He purchased a yacht and a marina front condominium. The second CID investigation was underway, and it turned up a number of things. One of them was the fact that MacDonald's marriage had not been as picture perfect as he had claimed it was. Turns out he'd had at least 15 girlfriends, most seduced when he was on training missions. Now Colette said her sister-in-law, Vivian Stevenson, knew of the affairs and had complained to her about them. So she would quote Colette as saying, "I give up. I don't want to do this anymore." So maybe she was going to get out of the marriage.
She could have been. She could have reached the point where she was ready to quit.
Well, sure. Colette was so upset that when MacDonald informed her of another upcoming trip, 3 months traveling as a physician for the Fort Bragg boxing team, Colette phoned her mother saying she wanted to come home with the kids.
Yeah, and her mother said, "Well, wait until spring." But then 2 days later, Colette and the kids were dead.
So that conversation would haunt Mildred Stevenson for the rest of her life. Her daughter wanted to come home. She didn't realize what was going on in the marriage, and she thought, well, you just wait until spring, the kids can use the pool. She had no idea what Colette was actually dealing with, and Colette probably didn't want to be embarrassed about her marriage, so she said, okay, we'll wait until spring.
And then there's a Fort Bragg secretary who said not even the murders of his family had diminished Jeffrey's sex drive. She told the CID about her having sex with MacDonald as often as possible while he was accused of murdering his wife and children. And this is also when he was confined to quarters. So these are, people are standing guard at his door and letting this woman in to have sex with Jeffrey.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's something, isn't it?
Uh-huh. So we're also learning some more stuff about Helena Stockley. Classmates were describing her as a disturbed, sad girl who liked to make up stories to get attention. One of these stories was her claim that she had to leave Fayetteville to avoid the cops. Now, the reality of the situation was that the police weren't looking for her, although she did actually leave town 2 months later in order to enter a hospital for drug addiction.
Well, Posey, the guy who first told police about Helena, also had a history of making things up himself, including the one story he said about seeing Helena Stokely getting out of a Mustang not long after the murders. The truth, Posey admitted after he failed a lie detector test, was that he wasn't sure about seeing Stokely that night, and he'd glimpsed the Mustang only in a dream maybe 2 months later. So that's not very reliable.
That doesn't help, does it?
No. The CID did find a more credible source in Prince Beasley, a Fayetteville narcotics detective who'd been using Stokely as his primary informant. Helena would do anything to get me to pat her on the back and act proud of her, he said. That's why she turned in some of her best friends. Thinking that she might have a lead on the MacDonald case, he said, he'd stopped by her house the day after the murders, but the only things she had to offer at that point were the addresses of several hippies who fit the descriptions of the alleged intruders, and that she had a black friend who sometimes came over to shoot up heroin and who always wore a fatigue jacket. As for her own whereabouts on the night of the murders, Stokely said nothing, and Beasley hadn't asked her.
Yes, so none of this is looking particularly helpful to Jeffrey MacDonald.
No.
I mean, at first glimpse, you've got this woman who fits the description that he gave as one of the attackers, and a guy who says he saw her getting out of the car that night. But on further investigation, none of this really stands up.
Well, it doesn't. And if you're talking about people who are on LSD, mescaline, and all this, how organized could they be that they wouldn't get caught or that he wouldn't be able to fight them off? It's just not super likely. And she's definitely not reliable.
No, I wouldn't even think she'd be reliable as a confidential informant.
I know, right? It's kind of scary.
But
if they're taking her word for anything.
That's a whole other thing.
And she's an unfortunate person who's quite messed up.
So Beasley, whom MacDonald's supporters would come to regard as one of the most important truth-tellers in the case, volunteered to accompany a CID agent to Tennessee, where Stokely was now informing for the Nashville Police Department. So she was happy to see Beasley. Then over the next 2 months, she's just spun a welter of contradictory stories. And after failing to match her fingerprints or hair to anything left at the crime scene, the CID prepared to submit a 3,000-page report, once again naming Jeffrey MacDonald as the murderer.
And he doesn't have any idea during this time that that's happening, right? He's just going along?
He's living the life.
Yeah. But as Freddie Kassab had discovered, believing MacDonald guilty was one thing, and actually prosecuting him was another thing. But things finally turned around in 1974, because Freddie was really generating some heat, and the Attorney General handed the case over for review. This is when a grand jury was impaneled in Raleigh, and after 7 months of testimony and evidence, the jury indicted Jeff MacDonald, MD, on 3 counts of murder. Now, it's questionable that it could have been 4, because Colette was nearly 5 months pregnant. MacDonald called Bernie Siegel, who persuaded the Fourth Circuit to throw out the charges on the ground that his client had been denied his right to a speedy trial. So this was clever lawyering. Prosecutors appealed to the Supreme Court, but for a year nothing happened. And in the meantime, MacDonald seemed to think less and less about his family. The nightmare that he'd been subjected to, he said, was finally over. But then he was indicted on 3 counts of murder in 1975. But due to several legal motions by his attorney, the trial didn't begin until the summer of 1979. In June of 1977, the Supreme Court announced that it would hear the government's appeal, and it was 16 months later that the indictment was reinstated. So jury selection finally began in July of 1979. This was 9.5 years after the murders.
It's a convoluted path, isn't it?
It is, but they're finally getting there.
We're getting there.
I think in the meantime, we should mention what Freddie and Mildred were going through, pretty much knowing in their hearts that their son-in-law killed their daughter and their grandchildren, and seeing him dating pretty girls, traveling, buying a yacht. It had to be really hard to live with.
Yeah. Plus, he basically severed all contact with them.
Well, how could you not? I mean, the guilt.
I mean, if they wanted to talk to him, they had to initiate the contact because he wasn't calling them.
No, and I mean, there wasn't anything positive going to come from that anyway.
Right.
But sure, I see what you're saying. But what was funny is that MacDonald really seemed to regard his upcoming trial as kind of just an annoyance at the worst. He really felt very confident that he was going to be acquitted. He had his defense attorney, Bernie Siegel, who he believed had really run circles around MacDonald's accusers back at the Article 32 hearing.
Well,
so he had every confidence in him.
Yeah, everything we've read indicates that's the case, that Bernie came in really prepared and just decimated the theories and evidence handling of the CID. So that's how he wasn't charged in the Article 32.
Right, but this is a whole different story now.
It's going to be.
Mm-hmm.
Now, MacDonald's certain that he would be acquitted, so he occupied himself with finding someone who could write his life story and who would turn over a share of the royalties to him.
Well, yeah, he's going to have a lot of legal bills.
He sure is.
Plus, he always wanted to be famous, let's be honest.
Yeah, I was going to say that this goes back to the narcissism.
Absolutely.
So one of his first choices was Joseph Wambaugh, who was a Los Angeles Police Department sergeant turned into a best-selling crime novelist.
I've read some of his work. Pretty good writer.
I've read pretty much everything he's written.
Yeah?
Yeah, he's an excellent writer.
Yeah.
I love it. His first book was The New Centurions, just about life in the LAPD. And then one of his famous ones it's called The Onion Field. It's a true crime story.
That was a movie when I was a kid that terrified me.
Those are Wambaugh. But Wambaugh and MacDonald met, and Wambaugh took the approach that most authors take, is that I will do this, but I'm the one that gets the final say on what's printed.
Sure. So he met with MacDonald, and he said that he had interviewed dozens and dozens of people who were survivors of horrific crimes, some immediately after the event and some many years later. But he said he'd never in all of his experience seen anyone describe an event like the one that MacDonald went through in the almost cavalier manner that Dr. MacDonald described it. So MacDonald found Joe McGinnis, who was another renowned author.
He was. And McGinnis did the same. I mean, I think it's kind of standard. But he told MacDonald, sure, I will write it, but it's my book, and I get the final say on what's written.
Well, sure, I think.
But MacDonald was convinced that McGinnis was going to write a story that was favorable to him.
Well, I think he felt pretty confident that he would charm him and convince him to be on his side. And I think in the beginning he kind of did. I think for a while he kind of had McGinnis believing his side of the story until things became more clear to him.
I think so. I mean, this is a book, I remember reading it 30-some years ago.
Wow.
That's how long.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just a superb book.
It is a superb book.
Got me hooked on true crimes.
Well, just before doing this case, we listened to the audiobook, and it is excellent. I mean, it's just as good as any fictional novel that you'll read. It's so well written.
He's a great writer.
Yeah. But I find it funny the way that McGinnis really kind of became his friend, right? He had him going to parties. He had him traveling with him.
Yeah, they hung out together. They were bros.
Yeah. But McGinnis didn't really feel the way about MacDonald that he thought he did, which kind of came as a shock to MacDonald. I think he first learned about it in a 60 Minutes interview, didn't he?
I believe so.
Well, anyway, the trial did not go well for MacDonald, and McGinnis was there for it, of course. Partly it was because of his attorney Siegel, who was very theatrical and pretty much over the top. The judge actually denied all 24 defense motions. It was also, I think, because of MacDonald's own witnesses, one of whom testified that a bloody imprint on the sheet used to transport Colette came from MacDonald's pajama cuff, supporting one of the prosecution's most damaging claims. The government brought in an FBI expert who reported that when MacDonald's blood-soaked pajama top was folded just so, its 48 perfectly round holes lined up with the 21 ice pick wounds in Colette's chest. So this was a really interesting part of it, and that's why I think the pajama top is such an important piece of evidence.
Right, and the other thing is that these were perfectly round holes. So, and if you have the pajama top wrapped around your wrists, trying to avoid knives or ice picks, there's movement. They won't be perfectly round.
No, well, to drive home that point, one of the prosecutors wrapped his wrists in a similar pajama top as another stabbed at him with an ice pick. Now, when this reenactment of MacDonald's version of events was over, the pajama top had these long, jagged tears, and the prosecutor even had a bleeding cut, unlike Jeffrey MacDonald, who didn't have even a scratch on his forearms.
And Siegel also hoped that Helena Stockley would save this case, but no amount of threatening or cajoling could prevent her from telling the story that she had just been too stoned to remember where she'd been between midnight and 4:30 a.m. on the night of the murder. Out of the jury's hearing, 6 witnesses swore that Stockley had said that she might well have been in the house. Might. But the judge refused to let them repeat their stories in court. Not only were Stockley's comments clearly untrustworthy, he ruled, but she had made most of them while she was heavily drugged, possibly even while she was hallucinating.
Well, I'm not a lawyer, Dick, but I don't think you can just take anybody off the street and have them testify that maybe they were somewhere.
It doesn't work, does it?
Without any corroborating evidence of that.
Yeah.
And especially if she's hallucinating. Come on, that's just not trustworthy, and there's no evidence that she was there. Now, on the other hand, there is some evidence that was destroyed, ruined, lost, whatever. So there's always that possibility that there may have been a sign she was there.
That's right.
Now, the final blow to the defense, though, was actually struck by Jeffrey MacDonald himself. He was very choked up and tearful and even angry on the stand, so overly emotional at times that he couldn't even speak. And this was so different from the way he appeared on the tape that the prosecution played when they had interviewed him, where he was this detached young captain being interviewed. And that was from 10 years earlier, where you'd think he might have been more emotional because he was closer to the time.
Wouldn't you?
But just that comparison, it made it seem very staged, I believe.
Yeah, it did. Now, it took the jury just 6 hours to make up their minds. MacDonald, who only moments before had been discussing whether to rent the Queen Mary for his California victory party, was obviously stunned by the verdict. He was found guilty of second-degree murder in the deaths of Colette and Kimberly, and first-degree murder in the death of Kristen. He received the maximum sentence.
Well, even as he was settling into his first in a series of prisons, his friends in California were hiring the former chief of the FBI's Los Angeles office. His name was Ted Gunderson, to reinvestigate the case. So he still had a lot of supporters out there.
Oh, he had, I think basically all his staff members at the hospital in California were for him.
Well, yeah, they had that big fundraiser that McGinnis attended.
Right.
I think that was right in the beginning of his book.
Yeah. They stood behind him quite a bit.
Yeah, and he seemed pretty sure that he was going to get off. Gunderson got MacDonald's approval to hire a Canadian psychic, and the psychic told Helena Stockley that she'd fallen in love with MacDonald and that the psychic could foresee a beautiful life for her if she would just aid in clearing his name. I don't know where to even start with what's wrong with that.
Oh, jeez. I don't think you have to.
Okay, we'll move on. So they took Stockley to L.A. to begin 5 days of nearly around-the-clock interrogation. Homer Young, an ex-FBI agent assisting Gunderson, later told the Bureau that there had been an element of duress in Stockley's questioning, which is a big red flag, and that his boss had employed unethical means and tactics in a very important case, But these methods did get some results. Stokely was assured that she'd be resettled in California, she'd get a new house, a job, and a new identity. They even promised her a part in an upcoming movie. So she signed a statement not only implicating herself in the murders, but naming 5 other people as killers as well. Now, according to Stokely, the group decided to annihilate the MacDonald family because of Jeff MacDonald's refusal to treat heroin and opium addicts. The prime target was Colette, followed by her 2 young children. Human sacrifice involving a pregnant woman is the most prestigious for the cult members, Stokely explained, followed by children, women, and lastly men. As the lone bottom of the totem pole male in the house, MacDonald was spared as long as he would furnish them with drugs. But he was not able to show any evidence that he had furnished them with drugs. And you think if he had, there would have been some kind of prescription or some kind of record of where he would have gotten them. I'm assuming they're talking about methadone or something controlled.
And even when this all occurred back in 1970, he could have said, they told me that they had killed my family members and they were sparing me because they wanted me to write prescriptions for drugs.
Yeah, he never mentioned anything about that.
There's none of that.
So even the story that she has doesn't match up with his story at all.
No, it doesn't. Early on the night of the killings, Stokely further said she was deputized to make a pretext phone call to the MacDonald residence. Colette answered, said that she was headed out to class and that a babysitter would soon be arriving, and that her husband would be returning home later. Afterwards, the group, which had decided to stage a Manson-style murder, conducted a satanic ritual, then, unaccountably neglecting to take along any weapons, drove to the MacDonald apartment, arriving around 2 in the morning. So 2 male companions went into the master bedroom to deal with Colette. Stokely said 3 other males roused MacDonald and tried to get him to sign a prescription for Dexedrine. MacDonald was belligerent, but after being roughed up, he agreed to call a friend who would procure the drugs. Instead, he dialed the post operator in an attempt to summon the MPs. This brought on a second, heavier beating, during which Stokely chanted, "Acid is groovy, kill the pigs, hit him again."
And none of this was mentioned by MacDonald in his interview. He never said that they asked him to sign a prescription or any of that.
Right, and there's no evidence of an earlier phone call.
No. Well, afterwards, Stokely said she proceeded to the master bedroom where Colette was being bludgeoned, as Kimberly lay next to her, sleeping through it all. The sight was too much for Stokely, who said she started ranting and raving, prompting Colette's attackers to depart for the living room. Soon, Stokely said she joined them, but after seeing MacDonald lying unconscious, half on and half off the couch, she went to Kristen's bedroom where she observed the younger MacDonald daughter dozing as peacefully as her sister. After a final inspection of Colette, Stokely stated that she returned to the living room and said to her friends, "Let's get out of here. She isn't breathing anymore." Now, her story, of course, has major problems.
Well, yeah. I mean, the biggest one, that it didn't even come anywhere close to matching MacDonald's count of things.
Not at all. But still, Gunderson went with it.
Yeah, but he threatened her with jail.
Right.
Then he promised her any statement she made was strictly for use in a movie. And he got a second statement from her, which added a 6th cultist to the crime, a character named Wizard. And soon got movie negotiations into gear. Still eager for publicity of his own, Gunderson made her available to the Washington Post, which turned out to be a major blunder.
Yeah.
Objecting to the tone of the piece, Stokely recanted her confession to the FBI and sent a letter to Gunderson, who, she now said, was a member of the Mafia. "Never," she wrote, "have I seen a bigger mockery made of justice or such a shambles made of an investigation." And this is referring to what Gunderson had been doing.
Right. Now, Gunderson began rounding up witnesses to back up Stokely's story, though. And the most crucial, as far as MacDonald's supporters were concerned, was a MacDonald neighbor who had testified at the Article 32 hearing that sometime on the night of the murders, she glanced out her window and spotted the taillights of a passing car. Under questioning by Gunderson, she remembered more. not only the time of her sighting, between 2 and 3 a.m., and the type of car, a blue Mustang just like the one Stokely claimed to have been riding in, but the fact that it was parked beside 2 other cars, one a military Jeep driven by a black man. The neighbor, who was observing the scene at a distance of 70 to 80 feet on a rainy night, described a man in the Mustang's passenger seat. I remember him specifically because of his piercing, deep-set eyes and the sneer on his face, she told Gunderson. I could pick him out of a crowd today. Shown drawings compiled from a recent hypnotic session with MacDonald. She selected one that, according to Stokely, was Alan Mazarol, a former friend and fellow cult member.
MacDonald was experiencing many ups and downs. On July 1980, the same Fourth Circuit Court overturned his conviction on the same speedy trial ground that it had used to throw out his indictment originally. MacDonald then went back to working as a physician in California. He bought a ski condominium, started dating an actress, before getting engaged to a 22-year-old flight attendant. 20 months later, however, the Supreme Court reversed the Fourth Circuit ruling. He applied for bail and sentence reduction, but the courts turned him down.
So finally worn out by the case, I guess, Bernie Siegel bailed, and he took a position teaching at a San Francisco law school. While a new set of lawyers prepared further appeals for MacDonald, Gunderson continued to pursue Helena Stokely. Now, Stokely's biggest shocker, except for her claim that one of the killers was an undercover CID agent, was that 3.5 weeks before the murders, she'd stolen a bracelet from Colette's jewelry box. This came as news to MacDonald, and Gunderson had it. He quit.
I guess he'd finally had enough of this stuff.
Well, it got quite ridiculous. Well, MacDonald's friends hired a former New York homicide detective to replace him, but he quit after concluding that all directions were pointing at MacDonald. Still determined, though, MacDonald's friends hired another ex-cop.
Now, they found Helena Stokely's decomposing body in a low-rent South Carolina apartment complex. She was 30, and she and a baby she'd had been living on peanut butter sandwiches. Gunderson suggested to reporters that she'd been murdered, but an autopsy had determined that the cause of death was acute pneumonia complicated by cirrhosis of the liver. Stokely's death was a setback for MacDonald. He was hopeful that things would change after the publication of Joe McGinnis's book.
Well, he couldn't have been more wrong.
No.
He thought that Joe McGinnis was going to write a book that would just show what a great guy he was and how he was set up and framed and treated badly by the whole justice system. But like we said earlier, McGinnis and MacDonald had become pretty close during these 4 years that the project had been going on. Early on, McGinnis frequently assured MacDonald that he did believe in his innocence. So MacDonald was sure that Joe was going to show everyone that he was innocent once this book came out. But he learned otherwise during this interview with 60 Minutes, shortly before Fatal Vision was released. According to MacDonald, Mike Wallace asked, "How would you feel if I told you that Joe McGinnis says you're a homicidal maniac?" And MacDonald said, "I don't believe you." So Wallace actually reached into his briefcase and said, "Here, I have the manuscript right here." So there's a good 60 Minutes moment.
So this was a pretty damning book, recording not only MacDonald's lies and infidelities, but also an incident that had occurred on a California cruise with one of MacDonald's girlfriends and her son. So MacDonald had become infuriated by something so minor that no one could remember what it was. MacDonald grabbed the kid, screaming that he was going to crush his skull between the gunnels and the dock. In the end, MacDonald settled for throwing him overboard. But the incident, which resulted in the fleeing of the girlfriend and her child, was terrifying. "I'll never forget that look in his eyes," said the boy, who by this time had grown into a young adult.
But Fatal Vision was hailed by critics as a true crime masterpiece, and it quickly went to the top of the bestseller list. There was also a docudrama on NBC in the fall of 1984 that had great ratings, and we just recently watched that on YouTube.
Yes, we did.
It was really pretty good. I mean, we've watched a lot of old made-for-TV miniseries about crimes, but this one was definitely higher quality than usual.
It was a good miniseries.
Yeah.
Now, MacDonald wanted Robert Redford to portray him. And he wasn't happy with Gary Cole in the lead role.
Yeah, but actually Gary Cole looked a lot like him.
He did.
Yeah.
And I thought he did a good job.
He's a good actor.
So MacDonald said in talking about Gary Cole, I thought he was wooden. I thought I was more expressive than him.
Yeah.
So with a new set of lawyers, MacDonald went back to court, this time not to seek freedom, but to charge Joe McGinnis with contract fraud for the amount of $15 million. When the jury hung, the case was settled for $325,000. The Kassams, MacDonald's in-laws, then sued MacDonald after the settlement, trying to prevent him from profiting for a crime for which he had been convicted. This suit was also settled, with the Kassabs receiving a percentage of the book's profit. However, at the same time, they paid for MacDonald's legal expenses.
And it wasn't released what percentage they got?
No.
Okay.
So, but anyway, after the case had been settled out of court, reporters who had generally treated MacDonald's claims of innocence with skepticism swung around a little bit. So, New Yorker writer Janet Malcolm wrote the article, The Journalist and the Murderer, which harshly criticized McGinnis. She stated that, in fact, McGinnis had become quickly and easily convinced of MacDonald's guilt during the trial. She also described how, in the same months that he wrote warm letters to the jailed MacDonald, he was also writing to his editor, discussing the technical problem of not spoiling his work's effect by making MacDonald in the book appear too loathsome too soon. I like that.
But my experience with the book is that he was very loathsome from chapter 3 or so. Because in the book, he has these different segments of the voice of Jeffrey MacDonald.
His actual voice.
Right.
Not a figment of anyone's imagination.
No, but things that he actually said.
Right. Taped interviews.
Yes.
Pretty damning.
Which don't make him likable at all.
No.
But throughout the years of interviews, MacDonald imagined that he was helping McGinnis write a book exonerating him of his crime. In the published Fatal Vision, McGinnis depicted MacDonald as a womanizer and a publicity seeker, as well as a sociopath who, unbalanced by amphetamines, had murdered his family. But to Malcolm, MacDonald in person seemed sturdy, unremarkable, and incapable of such a crime. So I'm not sure how I feel about that.
I don't know what she bases this on. Just personal interviews?
Yeah, pretty much that she thought he was innocent.
So she interviews him and says he's a likable guy. He couldn't have done it.
Yeah, and she was questioning the way that McGinnis handled it.
Yeah. So the consequence of this was a bunch of TV shows and articles that are told from the defense's point of view. MacDonald's cheerful and supportive California friends offered loads of material on supposed new evidence. But possibly the best witness for Jeffrey MacDonald was Jeffrey MacDonald. There's a sweetness about him, says Jeffrey Elliott, who interviewed MacDonald for Playboy and later testified in his behalf in the McGinnis trial. After meeting him, you would say, "This is a travesty. This is a good, decent, kind, thoughtful man, and the system has failed." You might be willing to do things to help him.
So while still in jail, MacDonald was not lacking for female companionship. He had at least 3 would-be lovers, a radio talk show host from Tucson, a law student from Michigan, and strangest of all, an Ohio woman who claimed that she'd witnessed her lover killing Colette and the girls during a fight over her. So that sounds like a nutty person.
Sounds like a first-class nut.
But MacDonald admits that he knew all 3 women and that he had sent them pictures of himself with his shirt off. And in the case of the talk show host, she had hoped to win a Pulitzer Prize by helping to free him. Now in 2002, MacDonald married a school teacher named Catherine Courage. They had met over 10 years earlier and reconnected in 1997 after she wrote to him in prison and offered to help him with his case. After they were married, he was able to be transferred from California to the Federal Correctional Institution in Cumberland, Maryland. So I didn't know that you could get yourself transferred to be closer to a spouse.
Well, that's pretty nice, isn't it?
Yeah. But if Jeffrey MacDonald is innocent, who could have murdered his family? I mean, let's go over one set of suspects who were eliminated. The CID reinvestigation in 1972 uncovered a number of potential suspects, but Helena Stokely and a group referred to as the New York Four were really the ones that came to the forefront. The New York Four consisted of Kenneth Barnett, Annette Cullity, Gary Burnett, and Joseph Lee. The Stokely group consisted of Helena Stokely, Greg Mitchell, Don Harris, Dwight Smith, Kathy Perry, Bruce Fowler, and Alan Mazerol. Law enforcement officials arrested Kenneth Barnett, Annette Cullity, Gary Burnett, and Joseph Lee in Suffolk County, New York, in May of 1970, and the Suffolk County Police then contacted the CID due to the fact that these 4 individuals did match the physical descriptions of the intruder suspects. CID agent Benny Hawkins traveled to Suffolk County to discuss the case with police officials. Hawkins discovered that these 4 individuals had rented a house in Fire Island with Jeffrey MacDonald's brother Jay back in the summer of 1969. Jeffrey MacDonald had visited his brother during that summer and was actually seen talking to people who matched the descriptions of these 4 at a bar called the Shortstop in Long Island. Joseph Lee was an African-American male, Gary Burnett and Kenneth Barnett were Caucasian males, and Annette Cullity was a Caucasian female. Lee was seen wearing an Army field jacket, and Cullity was known to wear a floppy hat and hip boots. The number of intruders, their racial makeup, and their clothing items all seemed to match the descriptions provided by Jeffrey MacDonald. Hawkins obtained fingerprints of all 4, but their prints did not match any of the prints found on the crime scene, so they were eliminated.
Pretty much. But in December of 1970, Jeffrey MacDonald and his lawyer went to the Suffolk County Police Department to read the May 9, 1970 arrest report. This trip occurred several months after the Article 32 hearings, and despite them matching the descriptions of the 4 intruders, MacDonald never publicly commented on this visit to the Suffolk County Police Department. So there's no evidence that he went there and said, "Oh, those are them." Right?
No.
Didn't do it.
But following the MacDonald murders, Helena Stokely did give a series of confessions and denials in the case. And the first time that she inserted herself into the case was right away. It was on February 19th, 1970. She told a newspaper reporter that she had no memory of her whereabouts on February 17th due to her excessive drug use. This version of events was the only story that she would repeat in the next 13 years. So her multiple confessions over the next decade were a series of stories that just didn't match any of the facts.
Right. I mean, that's the, maybe not the ravings, but the thoughts of a damaged head.
Well, she stated that cult member Bruce Fowler drove her and 4 other cult members to the MacDonald house. And she said that the cult members entered through the kitchen door and didn't bring any weapons with them, even though their plan was to annihilate the entire family. The cult members then confronted Jeffrey MacDonald in the living room, demanding that he sign that prescription for Dexedrine, and he said he'd call. But instead he tried to get the military police there. So these cult members said they beat MacDonald twice, and he fell unconscious in the hallway, and Stokely subsequently gave MacDonald mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. Now Stokely stated that she wore a floppy-sleeved blouse, a denim skirt, and she was the only cult member who was carrying a candle. So similar, very similar to the other story. But the thing was, the kitchen door was locked when the military police arrived, and Jeff MacDonald made no mention of a discussion with the intruders or a second beating. In her 1980 confession, Stokely claimed that Jeffrey MacDonald was beaten for 8 full minutes in the living room, and that Colette was clubbed to death on the master bed by 2 unidentified people. Stokely added that one of the children remained asleep on the master bed as her mother was beaten to death. And in a 1982 confession, she claimed that the cult planned on obtaining blood from Colette for ritualistic purposes, and that she knew that one of the children was transported back to her own bed, even though she didn't witness that taking place. So the information that Stokely provided to Ted Gunderson was included in a 1984 appeal for a new trial for MacDonald. The government responded to this and other appeal issues in a 91-page report. And in comparing audio tapes of Stokely's interviews with Gunderson to the typed transcripts, the government concluded that it became apparent that these were not transcripts of recorded interviews, but they were questions and answers which had been extracted from the tapes, arranged in a sequence after deleting conflicting responses by Stokely, and blended into a transcript-like statement, which Stokely later did initial. So the government also stated that during certain audio tapes, Stokely had come close to contradicting her previous whereabouts.
In 1990, MacDonald filed a habeas petition seeking a new trial based on newly developed evidence gleaned from over 10,000 documents obtained through numerous FOIA requests.
Freedom of Information Act.
Thank you. Within these documents, MacDonald found the following: handwritten lab notes of a CID investigator who testified at trial, which revealed that numerous blonde synthetic hairs up to 22 inches in length had been found in a hairbrush in MacDonald's home, and that the hairs could not be matched up to any known items in the MacDonald home. Doll hairs? Maybe. The girls would brush the hair of their dolls. Seems to be an odd thing for an intruder to brush her wig.
Right, and 22 inches is long, but if you know anything about making dolls, the hair's in a loop, so each strand would be 2 hairs on the doll. I mean, I guess someone on drugs could brush her wig, but to me that wouldn't be enough for me to think that MacDonald didn't do it.
Then in 1997, the Fourth Circuit Court granted MacDonald's motion for DNA testing of blood and hair evidence in the case. DNA exemplars and exhibits were sent to the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology for testing in 2000. Testing was delayed until 2005 because the Institute of Pathology needed to identify victims of 9/11, followed by identifying personnel who died in Iraq and Afghanistan. The testing was completed in 2006.
Jeffrey MacDonald's DNA profile matched a body hair that was found on Kristen's bed, a body hair on the rumpled bedspread found in the master bedroom, and a limb hair found clutched in Colette's left hand. Now, the 2 body hairs were not considered inculpatory due to the fact that both hairs were naturally shed. The condition of the limb hair, though, inculpated MacDonald in the murder of his wife. Now, the hair was bloody, broken, and located next to a splinter from the club. So of the 29 DNA exhibits tested by the AFIP, only 3 were unsourced. This included a body hair found on Kristen's bed, a pubic hair found in the body outline of Colette, and a 5mm hair fragment found in the fingernail scrapings of Kristen. The body and pubic hairs are not exculpatory due to the fact that both hairs have club roots, neither hair is bloody, and Colette was not sexually assaulted. So all of these factors demonstrate that the hairs were naturally shed. In regards to the hair fragment, though, the government has convincingly argued that the hair in Kristen's fingernail scrapings was just the result of lab contamination. At the 2012 evidentiary hearing, the defense argued that unsourced hairs meant that there were hippie home invaders. But the judge felt that this argument really lacked merit. MacDonald was denied a new trial in 2014. The Fourth Circuit Court also denied his motion for additional DNA testing in 2016. So he was denied parole in 2005, and his next scheduled parole hearing isn't until 2020, although that's kind of coming up now.
Year and a half, maybe?
Yeah.
Year and a half.
So is there anything you can say to convince me that Jeffrey MacDonald is innocent of his family's murders?
Short answer, no. No, I mean, I think there's just overwhelming evidence that he's responsible for the deaths of his wife and daughters.
I agree. I mean, he just seems like an awful person who did this. But I mean, it is so violent, it's hard to believe, really, that anyone could do this to their own family, especially their own little kids. So let's say that he's in the master bedroom, he hits Colette with the board, maybe once, maybe more times. So if he did kill Colette, and the older daughter was in the room for whatever reason, and he ended up killing her, I still don't see why he found it necessary to go and kill the baby who was in her bed.
Well, I think his thinking would be that even though she was in the bed, she could have heard things.
But she's not even 3. Is she really a witness?
She could be.
You think so?
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's why I think he got first-degree sentencing for that death.
Because he thought that one over.
Right. That was kind of premeditated. And he said, I got to get rid of this last kid, too.
Sure, but I think it could be just as likely that he thought about the other daughter and killed her as a witness, too.
Well, I think your supposition is correct that he maybe accidentally hit her while he was murdering his wife, and she is mortally wounded, and he had to kill her because she's going to die.
Horrible.
It is.
Okay, well, I guess that wraps up this discussion then, unless you have anything else to add.
I don't, except that I'm sure we're going to get opposing viewpoints.
Well, a lot of people follow this case, and I just like to say right now, I know that we didn't list every single detail.
Right.
There's no way to do it.
Which I'm sure you're going to remind us of, those of you out there.
Well, and I don't mind if someone wants to fill us in on things we missed. Just so you know, we realize that there's no way we could cover everything in 2 hours.
That's right. And our evidence, our ideas are that he's the guilty party. And if somebody has compelling evidence that has otherwise escaped the court's notice, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, I'm sure a lot of people would. Okay, well, before we say goodbye, I just want to remind everyone about our members-only podcast feed, where we do an extra episode once a month just for members only to hear. If you would like to have access to those, you can go to tiegrabber.com and join Team Tiegrabber. And what happens then is we're going to send you a great gift, some swag, and for a small monthly payment, you're going to help support the podcast and get access to these members-only episodes. The one we just did last week was on a little girl named Samantha Zaldivar, who went missing from her trailer park back in 1997. In October, we actually have a story which I think has a happy ending, the story of Shannon Matthews, which is a little girl who was kidnapped and was actually found. And that was a recommendation we got from one of our listeners. So that'll be coming up soon for members only. And in the meantime, we'll just be hanging out at the quiet end, waiting for you to come by and listen to us talk. So grab a beer and we'll just wait.
Right, and I'll just mention that we're going to delay feedback for a week.
Yeah, no feedback today. This episode is very long, took a lot of effort and energy.
And you're probably tired of listening to us at this point.
I know I am.
Saying, will you finish up already? So,
right,
we are.
So
we're done.
We'll be back next week with a new episode, and we will have feedback then. So if you send us emails or voicemails, don't worry, we will get to them.
We will.
Okay, so until next time, we will be at the quiet end.
See you guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye.